So the other bit is, and what I love about the book is this is also in a way sort of like a book on like social psychology, because it's a lot on what lay people believe. And in fact, uh, uh, being a layperson myself, I kind of had this belief too for the longest time, which is I always equated what we call human language to reading. And
Mhm.
in the blind storyteller, you state in page 203, if you don't mind me reading it, you say many people think of reading as a process of visual pattern recognition. For example, being able to consistently register the contrast between symmetrical letters such as D and B. If that is the case, then it stands to reason that when reading goes awry, the culprit is a visual deficit. But
Mhm.
but in reality, visual patterns are just a means to an end, which is language. Reading is a technology that gets you there. So, Professor, if you could delineate what the difference between reading and language is, that would be great, please.
So there are two things we need to explain. What is reading and how it differs from language?
Yes.
So the true theory, what is the true science about? And the second is what people think how this all works. So there
Yes,
is
that's a
the
better way of putting it.
scientific
Yeah.
theory and there's the intuitive theory, which happens to be in disagreement, and that's where we mess things up. So so there is a sense in which reading is very different from language. I often start my psychology of language classes by working really hard to disabuse people of the notion that language and reading are the same thing. They aren't. Language is natural. You take every child, they will develop language. If you don't expose them to language, they will grow one naturally, even if they're not exposed to a language. Um, they do it naturally. They don't need language lessons. Reading is not like that. So most children, if you don't teach them how to read explicitly, they will never read. There are tons of societies that are doing just well without reading and writing. Not so for language. So language is universal to all human societies. Reading is not. So they're divorced in this sense for sure. Nonetheless, there is this interesting property of human brains that the neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene has pointed out, which is when human brains come to invent a new system, they don't invent it completely anew, but rather what they do is recycle existing systems that are innate and kind of repurpose them for the new for this new purpose. And the link between reading and language exactly follows those lines. So when you look at how reading systems are designed, they could have been completely divorced from language. They could have been completely arbitrary, but that's not the case because the letters that we use for a system like alphabetic system like English correspond to linguistic sounds for the most part. Even in writing systems as in Mandarin, it's true that there are visual origins of the symbols that they also have semantic component, but eventually what they stand up for is also phonological sounds. They stand for syllables. So it turns out that when uh, people come to invent language, they kind of design it on the principles of how language works. You can think about it in terms of human brains. When they start processing language, they start with the phonology, and then so when you perceive speech, that the first thing that you get is the sound structure of language, and from there you proceed to syntax and so forth. So it's like, to go on the linguistic highway, so to speak, in the brain, you need to start by having some phonological code. So if you're trying to hijack the same highway to create reading, you better start by encoding phonology as well. And that's how it explains the correspondence between how reading works and how language works. Reading as a system is taking the language or hijacking a component of the language system and repurposing it to for a new technology.
Mm.
And that is why uh, all reading systems that we know of encode some phonological units at some level. It doesn't necessarily need to be at the level of phonemes. It could be syllables, but there is also some phonological component. There is a ton of research that shows that when you and I read, well, I'm not a native speaker, but when I read in my language and you read in your language, even though we read silently, we will automatically extract all this phonological component as integral part of the reading process. So you think about reading as a visual affair. It's something that happens only in your eyes. Of course, it begins with the eyes, but it looks like it invariably goes through the phonological system at some point, or else reading does not work as it should. So you must get some aspects of the phonology of what you read. How do we know that? Because if you get two words that have the same phonology, such as rose, the flower, and rows as in two rows of chairs, people confuse them all the time. Even if you'll have R-O-Z-E, which is not a word, people will also confuse them. And using the proper experiments, you can show that it's really the phonology that confuses them, which shows that people have consulted this information, or else they would not have been confused. So the point about showing how we stumble is to show how reading actually works, and the fact that the way it actually works is using phonology. It's using this part of language. So that's the real theory of reading. And we also know that when, that the ability to perceive sounds so it's not just phonology, but also speech. When the ability to perceive speech sounds is impaired, this is a characteristic of dyslexia. So people with dyslexia have problem with perceiving speech sounds. Now, that's not what lay people think. So if you ask a lay person, Johnny can't read, he's a 6-year-old and he can't read, what do you think is wrong with him? And invariably people tell you there is something that's wrong with their eyes. And if they think that there is something that's wrong with Billy because of Jimmy, whatever he is, that if the problem is congenital, which we know that's the case in dyslexia, that it is a congenital disorder, people invariably think the problem can only be in the eyes. It can't be this abstract phonological thing. This arises from this intuition that people hold, that we hold innately. So if you know that the problem is congenital, that he was born with that, then it must be somewhere in their body. But people don't think just genes. They think like in the eyes, in the ears. It can be something that is abstract, that doesn't make sense, that the ability to, so what dyslexia really is about is in part the mechanism that allow you to map letters to sound, and which is an abstract kind of cognitive mechanism, and people have trouble recognizing that something like that could possibly be involved or impaired innately. So this is unfortunate because it's first because people misunderstand what dyslexia is all about, and that's a problem, because if you think that, if you have a child and you think that the only signal of dyslexia is switching letters, then you will fail to identify and help these children early as you need to. But indirectly, it also tells you something about how we think about what is innate and what is innateness, and explain some of the other biases that I've shown in this book that show how our misconception about what is innate lead us to this crazy conclusion that what we know cannot possibly have an innate basis.